creative for long enough in his life to land him in a solitary confinement, part of a maximum security prison. His name was Bobby DeLello. And the environment that Bobby was going to be put into is that he was going to be put in a cell that was about 13 feet by 8 feet. So most of you have bedrooms bigger than that. And it was going to be made out of concrete. It was going to have a concrete slab where they would put a mat for his bed, and another concrete slab that would be like a little desk for him. And most of these units were made without windows, except his managed to have like a 5-inch window that was about 6 feet tall. That was like all he could see of the outside. And the only other opening in his door was a little slit in the door about waist high and one about ankle high. That way when they wanted to bring him out, they could shackle him first around his ankles and his arms. And so really the only kind of communication he could have is if he tried to shout through the 6-inch steel door to other prisoners that were in maximum security, and sometimes they could communicate a little bit like that. And he was going to be confined to this room for 23 hours a day. In this little cell, 23 hours a day. And 1 hour a day, he had a chance to like get a shower or get a little bit of recreation. The recreation would happen in a cage that was 5 feet wide by 50 feet long. The inmates called it the dog kennel. And they would take him out there and they could pace up and down that or run up and down that and get some recreation. And there was a chance that if maybe another inmate was in a kennel next to you, you could have a little bit of human interaction that way. But solitary confinement is, these prisons are designed to pretty much reduce to nothing all social interaction. If they were good long enough, they could maybe get a phone call. Eventually, enough months in, they could get a visit, but never any physical contact unless they were being like forcibly restrained by the guards. They were allowed to have a little bit of mail, some reading materials, and if their behavior was good long enough months, they could get a little radio. And then if it continued a few months longer, they could get like a little black and white TV for their cell. So Bobby DeLello was being put in this solitary confinement, and he told the journalist that the day they put him in there and they shut the door behind him, he thought to himself, this is going to be a piece of cake. No problem. Because unlike POWs and other hostage situations, he knew how long he was going to be in there. So he set up a little calendar to count down the days, and he kind of scoffed like, is this really punishment? I'm going to be able to make this just fine, you know. But as the reporters talked to him, he said it only took him a couple of months to realize just how devastating this situation was. He began to lose his mind within a couple of months. He began to talk to himself and began to pace back and forth in this little 6-foot space that he had in his cell. And it was just, he was having panic attacks, just getting so anxious, locked up in there, and he would just begin to scream out for help for no reason. He was just so terrified being in that room alone. And little everyday sounds like the sound of guards coming by or shutting doors would begin to just terrify him. He would just go into a rage in his cell. And it got so bad at one point, a few months in, that the walls, he began to hallucinate that the walls were changing colors around him. And after just 1 year, he began to hear the voices in the television talking directly to him. And it terrified him so much that he unplugged his TV and he put it under his bed, and he pretty much never took it out again. He was just breaking down as a human being. And the ironic thing is that even though he was so starved for human relationships and interaction, when he finally got a chance to interact with his lawyer, they brought him in for an in-person visit, like after his first year in solitary confinement. He couldn't handle it. He couldn't make out the words and the gestures that his lawyer was saying to him as they interacted. He couldn't put them together in his mind. And what really scared him is when he realized he couldn't generate any words or gestures himself to communicate with his lawyer. He just had a full-blown panic attack, just totally melted down, because he just could not function as a human being anymore. Craig Haney was a psychology professor who studied about 100 cases like this, and he said a lot of the common factors that he saw was that inmates would begin to lose the ability to just organize their life around normal behaviors. They couldn't organize around normal activities and things like that. And he said he would see chronic apathy, depression, lethargy, despair. In extreme cases, like people would just stop behaving. They would go catatonic. They just wouldn't move anymore. And the ones who kind of made it through and got out into the open, the way they saw themselves in the world pretty much changed forever. Instead of seeing themselves as participants in the world, people who could interact with other people and be a part of the world, they viewed themselves primarily as combatants with the world. So self-preservation and survival became the primary lens that they saw themselves through for the rest of their life. And the thing they concluded at the end of this long study about these multiple situations of solitary confinement is that we as human beings are essentially, at our core, social, relational beings. It is part of what is unique about us as humans. And I think Genesis 2 tells us that we are that way because God is that way. And when we are somehow less human, when we are devoid of relationships in our life, when we try to live disconnected from the relational systems that God has put us into, the image of God is not fully formed in us when we see our identity as primarily in a vacuum, like just me and God. Like my life is just about me and my choices and who I'm becoming. We are somehow less human when we see ourselves that way. And in Genesis 2, when God sees Adam and he says it's not good for him to be alone, and he makes the woman and he tells him, be fruitful, multiply, and fill up the earth, right? There's implications there, not just for like gender relationships and marriage, that's there, but there's implications for future communities that God already saw. For the future other that we would relate to. And as we follow the creation story into Genesis 10 and we see the nations being formed for the first time, the implications of how this first microcosm of a community interacted with each other had implications for all the communities that were going to come after that. And so the way that they interacted in this Genesis 2 kind of state of relational perfection, being open and cooperative and creating and sharing with each other and unhindered and loving and giving, that was the image of God that he intended for all of our relationships to reflect to the world. And yet we still are tempted, aren't we, to see our identity primarily as individually bearing the image of God. When we think about our identity, we think, I somehow uniquely bear the image of God. And that is true, you guys. You do. You have been made completely unique. And there are so many things about you that are special, that reflect God in a way that no one else does. But it's not the only thing that's true. We as a community, as you look around this room, we collectively have been made to bear the image of God in the world. And so how we relate to each other, how we relate to people on campus, how we relate to our families, it matters. In a cosmic way, it matters how we relate to each other. And I think for some of you this week that maybe God is going to want to challenge you to see your identity as connected to a community, as part of a community relating to each other. And for some of you, it's maybe that he wants you to understand that you're part of a community that together is relating to God this week. And so as we move out of Genesis 2 into Genesis 3, I look back at this loving God who made us because he wanted us and he loved us, and who created us in his image to be in a relationship with him and to co-create, to be in a relationship with each other. I look at that, you guys, and I look at our life now and the way we struggle in relationship and the way we see the world struggling, and we have to wonder, how did we get here? How did this happen, And unfortunately, Genesis 3 begins to unravel that story for us. This is where, things change in terms of our relationship with God. In all of this environment that God had created for them in the garden, do you remember there was just one limitation that he had set up for them? There was one tree in the middle of the garden that he said, don't eat from this tree. You can have everything that I've made. It belongs to you. Name it. Take care of it. Tend to it. There's just this one little tree over in the middle of the garden, tree of knowledge of good and evil. Just don't eat that one, okay? But everything else, you can have all of this other stuff. There was that one limitation. And that one limitation proved that we were free to choose God or to not choose God, to choose to trust him or to not trust him. And in the end, we didn't. We see the conversation that the serpent has with Eve and with Adam. And he begins to talk to them and ask them that question, what did God really say would happen if you ate from that tree? Do you remember that? And as Eve is responding to him, I get this sense that maybe they've already been to look at the tree, that maybe they have already been thinking about that limitation, because he wants to know what God said. And what God said in Genesis 2 is don't eat from the tree. But when Eve responds, she says that God told us not to eat from this tree or to even touch it. She exaggerates his limitation. And I don't know why she does that. I don't know if it's some sense of respect or fear about the limitation, or I don't know what it is, but I got the sense in that interaction that maybe they've already been thinking about this tree and this choice that they have. And we see that they make the choice to eat it. Genesis 3 says, it looked good to her, pleasing to see and desirable for wisdom. And so they ate from it. And as they ate from it, we see all the good things that God had made to live in harmony and interdependence with each other begin to break down, to deteriorate. Their individual relationship with God begins to break down as for the first time they hear his voice in the garden, and instead of walking towards him, they begin to walk away from him and to hide from him. We see their relationships with each other begin to break down as they begin to blame each other. He says she did it, and she says the serpent did it, and on and on and on. They're afraid now and naked and feeling exposed in the midst of community rather than experiencing a sense of friendship and intimacy with each other. Power struggles ensue, insecurity, shame, grasping for identity and worth, covering, talking about God instead of talking with God, hiding. His image in creation is beginning to break down in Genesis 3. There were these criminologists in the 60s and 70s who began to talk about, they were beginning to argue a little bit about wherever, they were saying wherever disorder is, inevitably crime is going to be there. So wherever in a neighborhood there's a sense of like mass disorder, there's going to be crime there. Or even a little bit of disorder, there will be crime showing up there. And they began to develop what they called the broken windows theory. Have you heard about this? The theory is something like, if there's a house or a building in a neighborhood that has a broken window in it that goes unattended, it will signal to the neighborhood that no one cares about that house and it's free game. And inevitably, within days, more windows in that house will be broken. It will begin to trigger an effect, and a sense of anarchy will spread from that building or that house to the street that it faces. And they called it an epidemic theory of crime. And so they wanted to test it. They wondered, does this theory of crime fit in every neighborhood? Like, is this just true in neighborhoods where crime is high, or is it true in every neighborhood? So they decided to test it in 2 separate neighborhoods. So they took cars and they staged them as broken down. One in the Bronx, where in the early 70s crime rate was high, and they put the hood up and they acted like it was broken down, and they left it sitting on a street in the Bronx. And they took another one on the other side of the country and they put it in Palo Alto, California, in an upper class neighborhood where there was a higher sense of, maybe if you see someone's property, you don't touch it, you leave it alone, that kind of thing. So they took 2 cars, hoods up, left them in the neighborhood. They wanted to see what would happen. In the Bronx, it took 1 hour before the first family approached it. And it was a family. It was a mother and a father and their little child. And they approached the car and they took the battery and the radiator out of it. And then over the next 24 hours, people in the neighborhood proceeded to come and take everything of value and worth out of the car, to strip it out and go use it for themselves. And once everything of value was taken out, the rest of the neighborhood came and just began to do like random destruction on the car. Just like bashing things, breaking windows, tearing the leather seats, ripping stuff off the car until it was just like decimated. And after that, kids just came and started to play on it like it was a playground. Well, they were watching the car in Palo Alto, and for a week it went untouched because it was just sitting there with the hood up. And they thought, okay, the neighborhood probably assumes someone's going to come and get their car soon. So they decided to take it a step further. They took a sledgehammer and they broke something on the car, just shattered something, left it, and began to watch. Within a couple of hours, not only did people come and join in and begin to destroy it, within a couple of hours, the car was totally destroyed and flipped upside down in the neighborhood in Palo Alto, California. And so they began to prove that the theory works no matter where you are. That when something is broken or destroyed and left in that state, inevitably more destruction will happen to it. And I live in a neighborhood like that where there's a house that's been standing open for years, and every window in it was broken, and my friends bought it recently and we're going to move into it, and they spent weeks repairing windows. Because people were just so used to this house not being taken care of, they'd break all the windows, they'd fix the window, they'd come back the next day, the window would be broken again. And so in neighborhoods where one window is broken in a house and it's left unattended, it starts a chain reaction. We begin to see crime growing in the neighborhood, property value going down, and the neighborhood begins to be viewed by itself and others in a different lens. It begins to be viewed as a place where tension and strife exists on a regular basis, not a place that you want to go and settle down. And so one broken window, we learned, doesn't just affect the house, it affects the entire neighborhood. And I think sin is a little bit like that. When you and I choose not to trust God and instead to trust our own sense of what is right and what's wrong, when we sin, we don't just vandalize the image of God in ourselves, we vandalize the image of God in the entire neighborhood. It begins to have a chain reaction in our relationships, individually, in our most intimate relationships, and in the relationships between our communities and our nations, in our environment. in the way we relate to work. And sometimes we get caught thinking that sin is just an individual affair, that it just affects me. But sin doesn't just affect us, it affects the whole neighborhood. And the effect that we see in our world of God's image being vandalized is our inability to relate to each other without strife and contention. The blaming and the hiding that exists now in our disordered communities. Our life of self-preservation, living out of that lens rather than living out of a sacrificial love for the other. Our labor now is about greed and making a name for ourselves and surviving rather than participating with God in something that He's trying to make in the world. And isn't it easy for us to see how greed-motivated labor has deteriorated the global community? And all these effects, they're at work in our most intimate relationships and at the largest kind of networks of relationships that we have in communities and in nations. And so as we have participated in sin and vandalizing God's image, every relationship in our life, the way we relate to ourselves, the way we relate to God, the way we relate to each other, it's all been corrupted now. And this is a sobering moment for us as we begin our week together. This Genesis story is the starting point for us this week. It's the beginning of the story of what God is doing and where we fit into that story. The fact that He made us out of love and that He created us in His image to be part of what He's doing in the world and to be in a relationship with each other, and sadly how we've participated in breaking down His image in the world. But there is this hope in Genesis 3 as I wrap up. There is this hope. If you look at Genesis 3, in the midst of their sin and the confusion and their hiding now and their shame and their guilt and their inability to relate to each other and their hiding from God, God is talking to them about the consequences. Remember that? He's telling them, because of the choices you made, this is what life is going to be like now. And it's daunting as we read that description. And in the midst of that, God notices that Adam and Eve have gone into the forest, into the greenery, and they've taken leaves and they've tried to make clothes. Do you remember that? Out of leaves, they tried to make clothes to hide their shame and to hide their sense of having lost the innocence that God had made them to live with. God's talking to them about the consequences, and He looks out and He notices they've made these leaf clothes for themselves, and He knows it's not good enough. He knows that what they've tried to do to cover up their own shame will not suffice. And we see God making new clothes for them, more suitable clothes for them, from the skins of animals. And it's the first time that we see bloodshed for our offenses against God. And He works to make more suitable clothes for them. Here in the very beginning of the story, when we see man first vandalizing the image of God, we see God at work, still because of His great love for us, making more suitable clothes for us. And as we move through this week, you guys, through these next few nights, I think we're going to continue to see how God is at work, making more suitable clothes for us, making a better way for us. In relationship with Him, in relationship with each other, and even in the way that we see our chance to work with Him in the world. He is making a better way for us. And so we have this hope as we begin the week. I just want us to take these last couple minutes to reflect a little bit together and to ask God to come and meet us during this week. So I'm assuming they put it down. You guys keep looking up. Was it up there? Will you put that slide up for me? This is what I'm going to ask you to do as we end tonight. Just as we're getting ready to enter in this week, I just want you to turn to one person next to you and just share with them, how have you seen the image of God vandalized on your campus maybe this semester? Or if you're daring enough tonight, maybe in your own life. How have you seen His image broken down in those places this semester? Just share one way that you've seen that with someone next to you. And then I want you to just begin to pray with each other that God will come and teach us some more this week about what it means to be made in His image, to be made out of His love for us, and to get to participate with Him in what He's doing in the world. So go ahead and do that. Begin to share with each other, and then pray with each other, and then I'm going to close us in prayer.